Hey there. Ready to dive into the world of environmental science and totally nail that job interview? We're going deep, deep, deep on how to show them you're not just a scientist. You are the environmental scientist they've been waiting for.
It's way more than just textbooks and test tubes, that's for sure. This deep dive, we're using actual questions straight from the field to get you thinking like an environmental scientist who's ready to hit the ground running.
We've got that career guide open right here. Plus, RoleCatcher's AI is standing by with some pro tips, like having a secret weapon, for your resume, for your interview prep. Okay, so let's just jump right in, shall we? One question I always find interesting is, how did you first become interested in environmental science? It seems so simple, but there's got to be a way to answer this genuinely without sounding like a broken record.
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's about genuine passion. That's key. Instead of giving some, generic answer, think about a specific event or maybe a teacher who inspired you. A book, even, something that truly sparked your interest, made it real.
So instead of the old, I've always loved nature, you could say, reading about indigenous communities and how they protect old-growth forests, that's what really, opened my eyes to the connection between social justice and environmentalism.
Now, that's what I'm talking about. That is a much stronger response for sure. It shows you're not just reciting some passion you think they want to hear. It's connected to real world issues. It gives the interviewer a glimpse into your values.
So it's about showcasing the why behind the passion, not just the passion itself.
Exactly. Now, another question that pops up all the time is, what experience do you have in, designing and conducting environmental experiments? This is where your scientific background, all that hard work really comes into play.
Okay, so it's about highlighting your relevant projects, right? And emphasizing those all-important analytical skills. But how do we avoid just, listing off projects like a grocery list?
You got to focus on the problem-solving part of it. What was the challenge you were facing? What were the outcomes you found? And what did you learn from that whole process? So for instance, instead of just saying, I conducted water quality tests, which is important, don't get me wrong, you could say, during my research on how agricultural runoff impacts local streams, I designed and implemented a whole water quality monitoring program. And get this, we found surprisingly high nitrate levels in areas where they were using certain fertilizers, which then led to...
Okay, I see where you're going with this. You're telling a story, you're showing the impact of the work you did. You're not just a data point, you're like an environmental detective.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to mention any setbacks you had or unexpected results. Those are gold. Shows you can adapt, you're willing to learn from challenges. Now, speaking of learning, interviewers always want to know, how do you stay up to date with emerging environmental issues and research?
That's where you mentioned all those journals and conferences, right? But how do you go beyond just the obvious ones?
Specificity is key. Mention publications that are really relevant to the actual role or the industry they're in. Let's say it's a position focused on renewable energy, right? Instead of a general, I read industry journals, you could be like, I'm following publications like Renewable Energy and the Journal of Solar Energy Engineering.
So you're basically saying, I'm already invested in the kind of work that you do. What about mentioning specific research or findings that have really influenced your approach?
100%. That shows you're not just keeping up, you're actively thinking about where the field's going, what's next, and hey, RoleCatcher's AI, that can actually look at your resume and then suggest relevant publications based on what's in that job description. Talk about staying ahead of the curve.
That's wild. It's like having a personalized research assistant. Okay, so we're showing passion, problem-solving skills, commitment to learning. What's next? I bet it has something to do with that social perceptiveness thing employers are always looking for.
You are on fire today. Employers want to know you can handle the human side of environmental science, right? So a question like, how do you collaborate with stakeholders and community groups to actually develop environmental solutions? That's them testing that very skill.
Because it's all about finding common ground, right? Achieving that shared goal. But how do you even showcase that in an interview without sounding like you just memorized the textbook definition of collaboration?
Think about a time when you actually collaborated really well with diverse groups of people. Maybe it was a community outreach project or a research thing that involved a bunch of different organizations. The key is to highlight, how did you listen to everyone? How did you respect those different opinions? And then how did you come up with creative solutions that addressed everybody's concerns?
So, for example, you could talk about a time you had to work with a community that was, super hesitant about a proposed wind farm project. Instead of just saying, we address their concerns, which okay, but you could be like, We held these community meetings where we really listened to their concerns about the impact on wildlife especially. Then we worked with biologists to come up with mitigation strategies that directly address those concerns.
Now you're talking. That's an excellent example. It shows you understand how important community engagement is and that you're willing to go the extra mile to find solutions that work for everyone involved.
Okay, so we've tackled passion, experience, staying updated, collaboration. I'm sensing a theme here. It's not just about what you know, but how you actually apply that knowledge out there in the real world, and who you work with to make a difference.
You've hit the nail right on the head. Now, let's move on to a question that's all about showing you can assess and then address potential environmental risks. How do you assess the environmental impact of a proposed project?
That's a big one. It sounds like it, yeah.
This is where you really showcase your assessment methods, that you're all about the details, and that you can really think through, like, all the what-ifs, the consequences.
So it's more than just saying, oh, I'd follow the standard procedures, right?
Absolutely. You want to show them you get it, Talk about analyzing that baseline data, figuring out what the potential impacts could be, figuring out how bad those impacts could be, and then what are you going to do about it, those mitigation measures. It's all about conveying that sense of responsibility and thoroughness. You care about this stuff.
So instead of just a simple, I'd conduct an environmental impact assessment, you'd go deeper.
Yeah.
Be like, okay, I'd use GIS mapping to overlay where the sensitive habitats are with the actual project plans. Then I'd model the potential noise pollution to the communities nearby.
Exactly. And you can tailor it even more by mentioning specific assessment methods or even regulations, especially if they're relevant to that role or that industry. And guess what? RoleCatcher, to the rescue. Its AI can actually look at the job description and suggest, hey, here are some keywords, here are some specific skills to highlight in your answer.
It's like having a co-pilot for your interview prep, making sure you're highlighting the right stuff for each specific role. That's amazing. What other technical skills come to mind? I know GIS is huge in this field.
You're right. GIS is essential these days. A question like, can you describe your experience with GIS and other data analysis tools? That's almost guaranteed to come up, so be ready.
Okay, so it's not enough to just say, I know ArcGIS. What would a really strong answer sound like?
Okay, so think back to a specific project where you really used GIS to analyze spatial data, create those maps, model environmental processes. For example, you could say, in my research on urban heat island effects, I used ArcGIS to map how the heat was distributed, those patterns. By taking that temperature data and overlaying it with land cover classifications, I can actually pinpoint which areas were most vulnerable to extreme heat. And that, helped inform urban planning strategies for green infrastructure.
Wow, that just creates such a vivid picture of you, like, in action, using those skills. It's not just, I know the software. It's, here's what I achieved with it.
You got it. And don't forget other data analysis tools, especially if they're right there in that job description. RoleCatcher's AI is so cool, it can even look at your resume and be like, hey, based on what they're asking for, you should mention these tools. It's like having your own personal career coach, but, digital.
That's incredible. It's mind-blowing how technology can really, level up your job search.
Totally. Okay, let's shift gears just a bit here and talk about a question that gets at whether you can think holistically about environmental issues. How do you incorporate social and economic factors into your environmental analyses?
Right, because environmental issues, they don't exist in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
It's all connected to social justice, economic development, how people are doing.
Exactly. When you're answering this, you want to show them you get that. You approach environmental issues with that bigger picture in mind. Think about how your work takes into account what different stakeholders need, what their values are. For example, you could say something like, when we were assessing the impact of a proposed dam project, we didn't just look at the ecological stuff, like how would this impact the river ecosystem. We also considered the potential economic benefits for those local communities, like job creation and hydropower generation.
Exactly.
And to make sure you're covering all the bases, remember that RoleCatcher can help you identify those social and economic factors specific to the job you're after. It's like having X-ray vision into the employer's priorities.
That's a game changer. Okay, so we've tackled some tough ones. Passion, experience, technical skills, even weaving in the social and economic side of things. But there's one question that always makes me think about how scientists are perceived. The whole stuck in a lab stereotype. Can you describe a time when you had to communicate complex scientific concepts to a non-technical audience?
Yes. This one's all about bridging the gap between science and everyday language. It's crucial for environmental scientists to be effective communicators, whether it's explaining findings to community members, advocating for policy changes, or even just sharing your passion with friends and family.
So it's not about dumbing things down, but rather finding ways to make complex information relatable and engaging. I imagine analogies and real-world examples go a long way here.
Absolutely. For instance, instead of saying anthropogenic climate change, you could say human-caused climate change, or even better, use an analogy like imagine wrapping the Earth in a thick blanket that's similar to how greenhouse gases trap heat.
I love that analogy. It paints such a clear picture.
Mhm.
So would you say it's about thinking about your audience and what would resonate with them?
Precisely. And don't be afraid to get creative. You could talk about a time you used visuals, storytelling, or even humor to explain a scientific concept. Maybe you gave a presentation to a local school group or wrote an engaging blog post about your research.
That makes me think about how this career guide also emphasizes the importance of respecting and incorporating indigenous knowledge into environmental work. In a way, that's another form of bridging communication styles and perspectives, right?
Absolutely. And it speaks to a growing awareness within the field that traditional ecological knowledge holds immense value. When interviewers ask, how do you incorporate indigenous knowledge and perspectives into your environmental work,
Yeah.
they're looking for more than just a token acknowledgement.
So it's not enough to just say, I respect indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
What would a genuine and impactful answer sound like?
Think about specific examples of how you've engaged with indigenous communities, learned from their knowledge systems, or incorporated their perspectives into your work. This could involve collaborating on research projects, participating in cultural exchanges, or simply taking the time to listen and learn from elders and knowledge holders.
For example, you could say, during my research on sustainable forestry practices, I had the privilege of working with a local indigenous community who shared their traditional knowledge of forest management. Their insights on controlled burning and sustainable harvesting techniques were invaluable to our research and challenged my own assumptions about forest ecosystems.
That's a powerful example. It demonstrates a genuine respect for indigenous knowledge and a willingness to learn from different ways of knowing.
It also shows a humility that I think is essential for anyone working in environmental science. We don't have all the answers, and sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources.
Exactly. Now, speaking of valuable insights, let's talk about a question that often throws people off. How do you prioritize environmental issues and allocate resources effectively?
This one sounds like it requires some serious strategic thinking. It's about making tough choices when it comes to where to focus time, funding, and effort.
You're right. It's all about demonstrating your ability to weigh competing priorities, make data-driven decisions, and justify your choices. Think about a time when you had to make a difficult decision regarding environmental resource allocation.
So for instance, instead of just saying, I'd prioritize based on the severity of the issue, you could walk the interviewer through your decision-making process. Like, when faced with limited resources for habitat restoration, we conducted a vulnerability assessment to identify ecosystems most at risk from climate change impacts and prioritize those areas for immediate action.
Exactly. And don't shy away from mentioning specific tools or frameworks you've used for prioritization, such as cost-benefit analysis, risk assessment matrices, or multi-criteria decision analysis. This shows a level of sophistication and a data-driven approach that employers value.
It's like that saying, hope is not a strategy. You need a clear framework for making those tough choices and justifying your decisions.
Precisely. Now remember, RoleCatcher's AI can be a huge asset in preparing for this type of question. It can analyze job descriptions to identify the specific environmental challenges and priorities that matter most to potential employers.
That's incredible. It's like having a crystal ball that reveals what's keeping the hiring manager up at night. So instead of just talking about your general approach to prioritization, you can tailor your answer to the specific context of the role and the organization's environmental goals.
Exactly. You're spot on. You want to show them you can think strategically and make those tough calls based on, solid evidence.
Okay, so it's not just about what you do, it's about how you'd arrive at that decision.
Right. You got it. For example, you could say something like, in my last role, we had a really tight budget for restoring a bunch of different habitats that were really struggling. So to figure out where to focus first, we did these ecological risk assessments, to see which areas were the most ecologically important and also which ones were most likely to totally fall apart without help. That way we could use our limited resources in a way that would actually make a real difference.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's all about strategy and making the most of what you've got. Okay, so we've talked about using RoleCatcher for finding jobs, for polishing your resume, and even for like rehearsing those interview answers. But is there anything in this guide about what it's actually like to be an environmental scientist? I mean, once you're past the interview, you've got the job.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's a whole section on just that. What environmental scientists really do, and spoiler alert, it's not all like lab coats and test tubes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, the guide really emphasizes how diverse the work environments can be. One day you might be out in the field, like knee-deep in a wetland, collecting water samples, and the next you're back in the office, analyzing data, or maybe even presenting your findings to like a whole boardroom of important people.
So you could be out in a rainforest one day, and then in a government meeting the next. That's so cool.
It is, and it also highlights how collaborative this field is. You're always working with other people, whether it's other scientists, engineers, policymakers, or even folks from the local community. So those communication and people skills we talked about earlier, super important.
Makes sense. You've got to be able to connect with people from all walks of life, not just other scientists.
Exactly. And the guide also talks about the incredible impact that environmental scientists can have. They're the ones on the front lines of tackling these huge environmental challenges like climate change, pollution, protecting endangered species.
So you're not just crunching numbers, you're actually making a real difference in the world. No pressure.
Haha, right. But seriously, it's a huge responsibility, but it's also incredibly rewarding, I imagine.
I bet. So for someone just starting out in this field, what advice does the guide have for them?
It emphasizes finding mentors, which I think is so crucial. No matter what field you're in, you need someone to learn from, bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
Also, networking with other professionals and getting as much hands-on experience as possible. Internships, volunteering, stuff like that.
Basically, just get out there and immerse yourself in the field, make connections, try new things, learn from your mistakes.
Exactly. And for anyone thinking about, like, switching careers to environmental science, the guide says, go for it. It's never too late. It talks about how valuable transferable skills are, like if you've got experience in data analysis, problem solving, communication, project management, all that stuff is in high demand in the environmental world.
It's reassuring to know that your past experiences can actually be assets, even if they don't scream environmental science at first glance.
Totally. And with resources like RoleCatcher, to help guide you, the possibilities are pretty much endless.
I love that. Well, this deep dive has been absolutely incredible. We've gone from feeling, honestly, a little overwhelmed by the whole environmental science interview thing to feeling, I don't know, kind of empowered and excited about the possibilities.
Me too. We really covered a lot of ground today, didn't we?
We did. From those essential skills and knowledge to nailing those interview questions to making technology work for you in your job search.
And let's not forget, actually picturing yourself in that job, making a difference. This deep dive was like a crash course in like everything environmental science careers.
It totally was. For anyone listening out there, remember, preparation is key. Take the time to think about your experiences, do your research on those potential employers, and practice those answers.
And don't forget about RoleCatcher. Seriously, their AI tools and that personalized guidance can make all the difference.
Truth. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and let's all keep fighting for a healthier planet.